and welcome to First Impressions, the self-explanatory show in which I, Angus Morrison, share my first impressions on a recent release. This is followed in 1 month's time by the reroll, which will take a look at how the game has fared after its release, its patches, bugs, DLC, and how it has been received by the public. Development rarely ends at release these days, and this show exists to try and account for a game's transformation across its life cycle. Please do share the video, like it, subscribe to be kept up to date as the follow-ups are released. This week I will be taking a look at Dead Space 3, which infuriatingly was released in America on the 5th of February and Australia on the 7th of February, but only came out in Europe yesterday on the 8th, though I can't begrudge Australia getting anything sooner than the EU, given how miserably they're treated most of the time. Dead Space 3 is oh my god, I can't tell what it is. I don't know what it's meant to be, but whatever it is, it's developed by Visceral Games and published by EA. I was both very excited and very, very afraid of the release of the latest installment in the Dead Space series. Excited because I absolutely loved its predecessor, and worried because I think everyone had a sneaking suspicion that it would go down a somewhat different path, which it has done. And this review will produce two very different results, not necessarily positive, but very different, depending on whether I treat Dead Space 3 as a survival horror game or a more basic sci-fi shooter. There's also the question as to whether I review it as part of a series or assess it on its own merits. If you watched my DMC review, and if you haven't, I highly recommend that you check it out, you'll know that I set it apart from the previous Devil May Cry games and tackled it as a standalone. That was because DMC was explicitly a series reboot. It was not Devil May Cry 5. Dead Space 3, on the other hand, is self-declaredly the sequel to Dead Spaces 1 and 2, so I'll be doing this review in the context of the series as a whole, which may not be entirely favourable. But let's start at the beginning and figure out exactly what genre this is. Dead Space 2, certainly, I can safely call survival horror, though I might attract some flack for that in the comment section. It revolves around you, Isaac Clarke, being almost alone in a decaying wreck of a space station, stalked by the hideously warped corpses of fallen humans. It is characterized by its solitude, the silence that dogs your steps, to be terrifyingly shattered by a lone necromorph exploding through a wall or a burst of static on your radio. The opening levels are characterized by helplessness, the later levels by the need to manage your different ammunitions and health packs, and saving the best guns and biggest heals for the worst situations. To top it off, your rapid descent into dementia results in unsettling hallucinations when they're least expected, and often least convenient. Right from the outset, Dead Space 3 sings a very different tune. Within the first 10 minutes, I was dismayed to find that Visceral have dispensed with the varied ammo types that lend tactical concerns to the firefighting. No longer do you have to conserve spears for your javelin gun in the fear that something bigger lurks around the next corner. You simply load up on generic ammo clips and blast away. This is actually indicative of Dead Space 3's new gung-ho style. Dead Space has always had its fair share of epic set pieces, space flights and boss battles, but the third game sees this taken to COD-like extremes. The first time a new monster type is encountered, control is wrested from the player for a long, slow-motion cutscene from which you can reliably judge what said beastie may or may not try to do to your pretty little face. Once their location and abilities have been well and truly pointed out, necromorphs will then charge while you unload clips into their fleshy appendages. Don't get me wrong, the shooting itself has retained all the qualities of the previous games. Strategic dismemberment is still the only thing that will stop a rampaging necromorph in its tracks, and classic guns such as the rotating plasma cutter possess a satisfying weight for an over-the-shoulder shooter. However, the constancy of the combat and the reliable alerts to the presence of each new enemy entirely undermines pretensions to horror. The introduction of a new enemy should come as an unwelcome shock. The player should be afforded no preparation time before being forced to combat the new threat. In a survival game, you must think fast and adapt to the new challenge at a moment's notice. The game should keep you forever on your toes. In this, Dead Space 3 is severely lacking. Rather than getting under your skin by way of oppressive silence and random attack, it opts to throw wave after wave of enemies at you. Taking them out becomes a matter of gritted teeth and nimble mousework. Mastering your own fear never factors into the equation. Gone is the feeling of being mercilessly hunted between save points, replaced by a long slog of predictable, if competent, brawn and butchery. Even the most basic of jump scares has been further undercut by Dead Space 3's musical direction. In keeping with Dead Space's more cinematic feel, everything is underwritten by a grand orchestral score, and some of it is very good. On its own, there are some great and some very creepy pieces, but Visceral have failed to realise that it is the absence of sound, the absence of action in any form that conjures fear. When nothing is happening, the player is left with the worrying sensation that something is about to happen, whereupon nothing continues to happen until they're hiding behind a cushion, then a mutant is dropped from the ceiling and all hell breaks loose. If there's one good thing to be said of the mutant onslaught, it's that it does force concern for ammo conservation. It's not the same tactical concern for the different kinds of ammunition featured in the first two, but there are so many enemies that you must often resort to using the environment to your advantage. Using Kinesis to fire Necromorph's own claws back at them makes a triumphant return from Dead Space 2, for example. Running out of ammunition begins to foster the seeds of fear once more. A case in point are the encounters with the regenerating Necromorphs. Removing their limbs will down them, but only for as long as it takes for them to sprout new ones. In these scenarios, you are made painfully aware of your dwindling ammo supply. You are wonderfully helpless in the knowledge that they can only be kept at bay for so long while you attend to other matters. It is unfortunate then that these other matters are frequently formulaic. On no fewer than 3 occasions in my 10 hours played was I asked to collect 3 pieces of X object in order to progress. Once is forgivable, twice feels like we're playing an MMO, and 3 times suggests a distinct failure of creative faculties. A low point occurs during the second level in which you're set upon by militant gun-wielding humans, and the whole thing devolves into a frankly unremarkable cover shooter. The sensation of the average is reinforced by the return of QuickTime events. You know my feelings on QTEs at this point. I think they can be very useful and often quite fun when used in short, sharp doses. Like mashing E furiously while the Necromorph stabs at your chest is one of these examples. When they're used to carry you through a cinematic which could otherwise run by itself, however, they become irritating and faintly patronising. Like the game wants to show its set piece, but it remembers that it actually has a player and has to begrudge them some token input. The problem is compounded when one missed button press means insta-death and an immediate restart, and Dead Space 3 is never particularly clear on whether it wants you to mash, press or hold any given button. Best make preparations to sail up a few mountainsides. But let's talk graphics. This is of course the PC version, and it's very nice to see the port released at the same time as the console equivalent, and it's attracted a lot of ire for the admission of executive producer Steve Papoutis that the PC port would receive absolutely no special treatment to reflect the added power of the gaming rig. I'll be tackling this in more depth in the Dead Space 3 reroll, but honestly, if he'd kept quiet, I don't think anyone would have noticed. If you're really paying attention, it is possible to see some lower res textures than one might expect on PC, but as a whole, Dead Space 3 looks phenomenal. The space flights and planet-side sections are beautiful, being richly detailed and absolutely saturated with colour. Those of you who have watched my previous reviews will know just how I feel about gratuitous colour usage, and to see it juxtaposed with the gloom of the decaying inside spaces is wonderful. You're not given precise control over the full spectrum of graphics options that you'd see in a dedicated PC game, but Visceral have attended to far more than their initial statements seem to promise. If you dig around the INI files, for example, it's even possible to change your field of view, which is a mercy because it seems that Visceral have reduced it from the default of the previous games. I do wonder whether this is an attempt to artificially generate feelings of panic and claustrophobia in tight spaces, but I feel the game, and particularly the UI, is better served by increasing it to around 90 degrees from the default 75. Facial animation has made great strides from Dead Space 2, and the actors play their parts well in a sometimes hackneyed script. Even the truly unlikable characters, more caricatures to force the theme, even they can't be faulted on the grounds of delivery. The only British man is, predictably, the bad guy, but hey, I'm quite enjoying our role as the typecast representatives of pure evil. A minor complaint that I can't seem to fit in anywhere else relates to the love interest costume choice. Ellie is meant to be a hardened space engineer holed up inside a necromorph-infested wreck. Why then is her top cut lower than the Titanic? Come on, Visceral, this is beneath us. Your excellent facial modelling tells us she's a woman. We don't need a fleshy reminder, especially given the ongoing danger posed to everyone's internal organs. Right, moving on. The weapon crafting system. I feel it's not so much bad as slightly misplaced. You collect various resources from around the world and from stomping monsters into oblivion, and these components are used to craft new weapons with primary and secondary modes of fire and assorted attachments. It offers a lot of scope for satisfying, if slightly convoluted, personalization. Finding raw materials certainly makes more sense in an apocalyptic scenario than expending credits on a shopping trip. I take issue with it, however, because it collides head-on with this survival horror shooter problem. Where Dead Space 2's vendor and upgrade locations offered the briefest respite from the horrors outside, the sequel can see you happily tinkering away and fine-tuning your creations as if nothing in the world was wrong. The system itself is solid, but detracts from the immediacy of the horror. And this brings us at last to the microtransactions, and hasn't this been a talking point? In addition to the purely cosmetic items, which I have no problem with, Dead Space 3 allows you to buy, using real money, components for upgrading weaponry. I got into a debate the other day with someone who was convinced that these were a very good thing. He said it was good that casual players should be afforded the opportunity to buy their way through if they should so choose, and if I wanted a survival horror experience, I should simply turn up the difficulty to hard. Let me stress that this has absolutely nothing to do with the casual hardcore debate. Nothing. It's once again tied to the genre crisis that Dead Space seems to be having. In a survival horror game, the challenge, whether you have it on easy or impossible, should be psychologically demanding. If it becomes possible to buy your way into better weaponry outside of the game's constraints, even if you never intend to use the feature, the knowledge that that option exists completely removes the fear of failure, and the need to be vigilant to live and succeed. The entire tone of the game is fundamentally changed by the inclusion of functional microtransactions. This is not the raving of an anti-casual fanatic, this is a demand of the genre. I don't insist that Hello Kitty Island Adventure includes guns for my benefit because I'm hardcore. It is not unreasonable that a survival horror game asks you to survive. Ultimately, Dead Space 3 tries to be all things to all people, and it doesn't succeed particularly well. Taken on its own merit as an over-the-shoulder shooter, it's a satisfyingly weighty gore fest with some really great visuals, let down by the sense that something is missing. As a survival horror game, it's rubbish. Well, it's not a survival horror game, by any standards. Buy Dead Space 3 for a decent adventure through a well-realised universe, but don't expect to be kept on the edge of your seat. I continue to be Angus Morrison. Remember to like and subscribe at the end of this video for my review of Crysis 3 on 22nd of February, and thank you very much for watching.